Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Javar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Chapter 2, Halacha 1 of Peah. A bit about Chapter 2 in Peah. The Torah is going to go ahead and establish the Peah obligation with respect to the field by stating in Leviticus 19:9, you shall not finish off the corner of your field to harvest it. Your field. It says your field. And you shall not finish off the corner of your field in your harvesting. There is an obligation to leave Peah from each individual field. And if you left Peah on one field, it doesn't count over to another field. So let's say you own two fields. You own one wheat field in Tiberias, and you own one barley field in Jerusalem. You can't take the barley field and leave Peah there, but not leave Peah in Tiberias. When the Lakona Kodesh is working here and trying to show you this diktuk, your field, it's trying to say that the obligation to leave Peah is going to be on each and every field that you have. And this is what Chapter 2 is going to be covering. It's going to be covering what happens in one field versus another. It's going to really talk about these different separations within the field that are legally going to divide it with regards to Peah and how Peah is going to be given in each separation. So you say to yourself, why do I care about that? And the answer is because if you're going to be Jewish and you're going to be religious and you're going to have a field, you have to know this stuff because the poor people do know this stuff and they open up the Torah and they read it and they're going to see Peah and they're going to come to the field and they're going to be expecting to get Peah. If you're leaving Peah only on that barley field in Jerusalem but not in Tiberias, what about the poor people who are coming to your field in Tiberias? They don't get Peah? So each and every field is going to have Peah. Let's say you have one field of barley on this piece of land over here, and over here on another field very close by you have wheat. Well, the person's going to be coming over to get barley over here, and then he's going to walk all the way over there to the other part of the field or another field in the same area to get wheat. You can't do one for another. Now it's going to talk about these separations. So the Mishnah in Halacha 1, Chapter 2, starts off talking about these separations within the field of seeds like grains and legumes that divide it into two fields. And it's going to necessitate two different Peahs for each segment. And again, keep in mind, we're talking about fields of seeds like grains and legumes. We're not talking about trees. That has a whole nother set of issues for trees. But this is for things that grow with seeds that are subject to Peah. So the Mishnah starts off saying, these divide a field with regards to Peah. So this is talking about a field that it's one common area and one common property ownership. And so these divide a field with regards to Peah. A stream, a canal, a canal that would be like an irrigation canal so that you can take off the water. That would be like an irrigation canal so that you can take off the water laterally into the field. That was an older way to make sure that you had irrigation to your field by digging a big canal and then taking off strips from that bigger canal into the field, and that way you could distribute the water easily. So that big irrigation ditch that you're doing to divide the field is going to count for dividing a field. Another is going to be a private road. Another is going to be a public road. So if you have a road that's clearly there, a private road is going to be 4 amos wide, and halachically a public road is going to be 16 amos wide. And we know that in the Mishnah Baba Batra 6:4. And the Gemara is going to talk later in this halacha on why the Mishnah is going to list both a public and a private road. Then the next thing in the list is going to be a private path and a public path. So a path is going to be where it's going to be easy to get access to going to get crops. And we know that a path is going to be smaller and more narrow than a road. Thus, a public path is a public route that is going to be smaller than 16 amos, and a private path is going to be a private route that is less than 4 amos. And another way to look at it, the Rosh, in his commentary on Baba Batra 55b in the Bavli, is going to maintain that the difference between these roads and paths is going to be that it can be used by animals and wagons, whereas paths can only be used by people. And so these are like footpaths that are wide enough for a person to walk by placing one foot directly in front of the other. The Ravad has a different interpretation on this. He's going to say that the difference between a road and a path is not the width, but its direction. A road is going to go from town to town, and a path is going to run from field to field. The Rambam in his commentary on this particular Mishnah in Peah, he's going to follow the Ravad's definition. So we can see here that the Mishnah is splitting up land ownership, and in these splits in land usage, and in these splits of land usage, we can see that it starts to divide the field, so that people are going to be looking at this part of the field is over here, and that part of the field is over there. So that even if you're growing on one side of an irrigation ditch wheat, and over here on the other side you're growing wheat, it's going to be counting as two different fields, and that means that you're going to have to be giving two sets of Peah, because again, the poor person is going to be expecting two sets of Peah, one Peah for over in this area and one Peah for over in that area. And halakhically, by splitting up the land usage like this, you're effectively creating two different fields. Even if it's still for wheat, you've effectively created two wheat fields. It goes on to continue. It's going to say that for the public path, that this is in use both the dry and during the rainy season. So the Mishnah was only talking about paths and roads, but not necessarily about year-round use. So roads that divide a field may not be year-round use, but the paths, they can be used throughout the year, both in the summer when the crops have been reaped, and in the winter when the crops have to begin to grow and they're susceptible to damage. So later on in the sugya, when it talks about the Mishnah, it's going to talk about the private and the public paths later on in the sugya, and then it's going to talk about fallow land that has not been planted or plowed. Just as a note, that in Genesis 47:19, there's a command that, and the land shall not become desolate. You're not supposed to leave land in Eretz Yisrael desolate. So how could it be that you have a farmer that's violating Torah law and leaving it desolate? So the Rosh and the Rosh give the following explanation. They're saying that when it's talking about this land that's fallow, it's talking about dry, rocky ravines that are unsuitable for cultivation. And the Mishnah is going to add bor, which means fallow land, to teach that even fertile land that happens not to have been planted is also going to be separating and dividing the field in two. So let's say you have a farmer who is violating this command in the Torah and has good, arable land that he can grow agriculture on, and he decides not to plant it for whatever reason. He violates a halacha and a mitzvah, and he doesn't plant the land. That's still going to be a separation. That's still going to be a separation and a border. That, by the way, can take place with regards to laws of kalayim, because depending on the width of that land, he can go and plant other kinds of crops, or even a vineyard, depending how wide that unirrigated land is. That land that's supposed to be used, that's not being used. Alternatively, like we were talking about with olive trees, a lot of the land in Eretz Yisrael is filled with boulders and is not suitable for planting grain like wheat or legumes, because you can't get enough economy of scale. You can't till the soil. So in the hilly areas in Jerusalem, you can't till the soil. There's boulders everywhere. Walk outside to the Jerusalem forest or just walk around. You see boulders all over the place. So you can't really get a lot of economy of scale in this particular area and grow big fields of grain. So in terms of not planting the field, that would be that kind of land. It's just not suitable for cultivation for things having to do with the seed, with grain or legumes. Then it's going to talk about plowed land that has not been planted. This is basically like a strip of land in the middle of the field that's planted with a different species. And this is going to get into the laws of kalayim, and you can see more about that in Chapter 2 in Kalayim, Halacha 8. Chapter 2 in Kalayim and Chapter 3 in Kalayim talk about these fields where you have plowed land that hasn't been planted and also has different species next to each other. And the arrangements of those kinds of farms or gardens are very complicated, and you have to look in Kalayim for those sorts of arrangements. But let's just leave it simple here, that plowed land that has not been planted and a different species, and if one harvests, so again, different species can leave it as a separation of a field. But again, please check the rules in Kalayim Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 to see these very unusual arrangements of how a garden or a field can be done, where the field will not be subject to Kalayim, but it will still count as a field. So very complicated sets of halacha there, but the Mishnah still refers to it with different species as dividing. And the Mishnah continues, says, if one harvests a strip of unripe grain in the middle of the field, the harvested area divides the field in two. These are the words of Rabbi Meir. But the sages say the harvested area does not divide the field unless he plowed it. So it could be that maybe there's no disagreement at all between Rabbi Meir and the sages. Maybe the sages are refining the words of Rabbi Meir. Maybe it's not a maloket, but we'll see later. When you look at it in terms of the first understanding of what Rabbi Meir is saying, if one harvests a strip of unripe grain in the middle of the field, the harvested area divides the field in two. This is basically where you're cutting the grain in the early stages of growth. And the farmers sometimes would cut grain in this stage to use to feed their animals. Maybe they just needed the grain to feed the animals and they didn't care about the wheat, and they went into the middle of the field to just start cutting. So it could be that that's one case where this would happen. The Mishnah is talking about a case where the farmer cuts a strip of unripe grain down the middle of the field in order to use it to feed his animals. And according to Rabbi Meir, that strip now that he cuts constitutes a division of the field. Therefore, the grain on either side of that strip is going to be cut later at the proper time, and Peah now has to be given specifically from both sides of the field. That's basically what Rabbi Meir is saying. The Rosh Cirillo is going to explain about this, that the basis for this dispute between Rabbi Meir and the sages are going to be explained later in the Sugya. It should be noted that the sages are teaching that a plowed strip divides a field only when it is present at the start of the harvest, but not when it is created after the harvest begins. These divide a field with regards to Peah. The Mishnah just taught that the various separations divide a field in two, and that requires separate Peah to be given for each section. This presumes that Peah left in one field cannot exempt the obligation due to a neighboring field. So the Gemara is going to ask for a scriptural basis to this law. How do we know this is the case? How do we know that that if the field is divided, or you have two different fields effectively in some combination of this, that you can't leave the Peah for over here for over there? In other words, let's say you have a huge irrigation ditch, you've split this wheat field in two, and you are just leaving Peah. You are just leaving Peah in the left side of the field, and you're saying, I'm going to add a little bit of my Peah here, and that's going to count for the right side of the field, field number 2. So how do we know from the Torah, from the diktuk of the Torah, where do they learn this from? Where's this tradition from, that the sages know this, that this is really the case in the Torah? So the sugya says, and it is stated, Sedecha, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not finish off the corner of your field. It says the word Sedecha. And we're looking here at Leviticus 19:9 and also 23:22. So it says the word your field, Sedecha, is in the singular. And that teaches that one may not give Peah from one field for another. In other words, the sugya is saying that if it was sadot, your fields, that you could be giving Peah, for this field on behalf of that field. But because the Torah is writing in the singular, then it means that you can't leave for this field for that field. And the sugya is saying that if it were in the plural, it would mean that you could leave this field for that field for Peah, but it's not. It's written in the singular tense, your field singular. And because it's written your field singular, it means that your field over here has Peah, and it would mean that if you have this division, as talking about in chapter 2, Halacha 1, that your field over there, in field number 2, that has a second set of Peah. So the Vilna Gaon in Masechet 2 and Shenos Eliyahu is going to explain it like this. He's going to say that the derivation is going to be that it begins by speaking the harvest of your land, and then switches to speaking of the corner of your field. The Vilna Gaon says, now the word land is a broader term encompassing many fields. And by switching from the inclusive land to the specific field, the Torah teaches that the Peah obligation of a field cannot be fulfilled by leaving it in other fields, the land, but must be fulfilled in each field separately. So the Vilna Gaon is basically deriving that from the word your field, that field of trees is also going to be obligated in Peah, but it does not contradict this derivation here. And because that the verse, you shall not finish off the corner of your field, is appearing twice, both in Leviticus 19:9 and also in 23:22, that one law may be derived from each verse, so that the Gemara above presents yet another verse for Peah obligated trees, so that the word your field need only teach one law. So that we are going to be getting into Peah for trees later, and that's a complicated set for separations and divisions. It's going to be different than for grain. And again, it has to do with how the land is going to be arranged. Again, in Eretz Yisrael, you have areas that are smooth with big tracts of land that don't have a lot of rocks in it. You could just plow it and plant fields, no problem. And in rockier areas, you also have agriculture, like for olives. And in the rocky areas in Jerusalem where you can't get out and plow a huge field, that you're gonna have fields of olive trees. But this is talking about separations of fields for these kinds of grains, and these kinds of grains are going to be having it where that if you have two fields, effectively what the sugya is saying is that Doraita, that you're going to have to leave from two sets of Peahs, one from each field, and they're understanding that as being Doraita. So now the question is going to get into whether these specific separations listed are going to be biblical or Doraita. We know that if there's a separation and you have two different fields, and again you could have two different ownerships, one ownership of the field in two different locations. You have a field in Jerusalem, you have a field in Tiberias. You can't leave, according to Doraita, you can't leave Peah in the field in Jerusalem for the Peah in the field for Tiberias. The Torah is coming and saying it's Doraita that you have to leave two sets. But now they want to know, wait a second, but what about these divisions in the Mishnah? Are these divisions going to be D'Rabbanan? Or are these divisions, like the irrigation ditch or the road, are these going to be rabbinic? So let's get into it. Sugya says, and it is not clear biblical law that the separations listed in our field, in our Mishnah, divide the field. If you say that it's Doraita, it's clear biblical law that these separations divide the field, such as the road or the irrigation channel or these strips of unirrigated land, then they should also divide fields of trees, which they do not. So the sugya continues that we have learned in a Mishnah there, being in Halacha 3, that's going to be later on in chapter 2 in Peah, that everything, all the separations listed in our Mishnah here, divides for fields of trees. Divides for fields of seeds, so that grains and legumes are going to be subject to these kinds of separations. But the law is that nothing divides for a field of trees except for a fence. So they're saying that, let's say you had an almond grove, or let's say you had olive trees, and it's bisected and cut with a irrigation channel, or there's a public road. They're saying that the Peah on this side of the olive grove and the other side of the separation can discharge the obligation of trees on the other side, but only a fence that's at least 10 tefachim high can divide a field of trees into two. But in terms of seeds and for grain and trees, the separation is going to be different. Now, the sugya is saying that had these separations in the Mishnah been Doraita and biblical law, that this would have applied to trees as well. And because we don't see this being applied to trees for the irrigation channel, for example, then it means that it's D'Rabbanan. So now they want us to continue to say, well, what about the fence? Is the fence at least going to be a D'Rabbanan or a Doraita separation? Since that's the one thing we have in common between the field of grain and the olive trees, the field of trees. Well, maybe the barrier, this field, this fence in the field, maybe that's going to be a biblical separation. So the sugya says, now this might imply that the fence, the law that a fence divides a field is a clear law, definitely biblical, since it divides even the field of trees. But the Gemara counters and it says, but that too is not a clear law. It says that for if you say that it is a clear law, then even when there is a knocking branch above it, that the fence should divide a field of trees, and it does not. So in other words, it's this case that you have the branches of the trees on both sides of this wall. They meet over the wall and they bounce into each other and they become interlocked. And by becoming intertwined, the fence is really not dividing the field. So that they're basically saying that, well, if this were really a deraita obligation, a deraita division with the field, then for the field of trees, then the interlocking wouldn't matter for the branches. And because the interlocking of the branches does happen, that it's showing that it's not D'Rabbanan. This is what the Sugya is saying. Sugya continues and says that, as we've learned in the Mishnah, if there were knocking branches above the fence, it does not divide the field at all. Rather, he gives one peah for all the trees on both sides of the fence, and this distinction demonstrates that the law that a fence divides a field of peah for trees or grain is not a clear biblical law. So basically, in other words, in other areas of Torah law in which a fence is going to divide one area from another, its capacity to do so is not undermined by overhanging interlocked branches. But in the case here, where the fence is viewed as extending up to the sky, you have this thing getting in the way where the interlocking branches are sitting there breaking this up. So if you were to have a field division where you just had a fence and there was no interlocking branches, then that's going to be another story. So the Gemara is going to consider a possible way out of this proof, and it's going to reject it. Here's what the Sugya says. It says, if you wish to say that this rule concerning the knocking branches that overhang a fence is also a clear biblical law, then even when the branches interlock on just one side of the fence should not divide the field. Whereas we learned in a brisa, if there were knocking branches on both sides of the fence does not divide the field. This implies that if the branches interlock on only one side of the fence, it does not divide the field. This distinction regarding the circumstances in which knocking branches negate the power of a fence to divide the field must surely be rabbinic. And this in turn means that the very law that a fence divides a field itself is going to be rabbinic. So that, in other words, that we can see a rabbinic, a Doraita law for leaving two Peahs from two separate fields. But if the law that a fence divides a field were going to be biblical, it would mean that separate Peahs would be biblically required for each side of the fence. But the rabbis cannot really say that the interlocking branches negate that division, since it would result in one Peah being given from both sides of the fence. You can't make something that's going to be more lenient than biblical law, and that would effectively be allowing one Peah for this kind of field where the biblical law requires two. So that, in other words, requiring Peah in two places rather than one is going to be part of the issue. In other words, that the Gemara is basically concluding that although separate fields require separate Peahs under biblical law, the separations listed in the Mishnah are going to be rabbinic. And the Rosh Cirillo is going to say that the Gemara, all the separations listed, including the fence, divide only by rabbinic law. The Gemara is basically arguing that if this were true, there'd be no reason for the rabbis to have differentiated between branches interlocking on both sides of the fence or on just one side of it. Rather, the logic of the matter would be that just as branches interlocking on both sides of the fence undermine the capacity to divide it, so too the branches interlocking on just one side also undermine it. And because the Barais is implying that the branches do not undermine a fence when they interlock on only one side of it, we see that the law of the fence and the interlocking branches is not based on a logical distinction, but on a halacha l'Moshe miSinai. So, on a related statement, Rabbi Yossi says in the name of Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina, if one separates Peah from one side of a field, from one field for another, it does not take effect, and the Peah set aside is thus treated as ordinary produce, which is subject to Truma and Meiser. So again, if we're coming along and dividing what Peah is going to be, and we're going to say Peah is going to be the corner of your field, and we have a Doraita thing that you have two fields, or the separation between to create these two fields, even if it's both wheat fields, and you're saying that I'm designating on field number one Peah for field number one and field number two, and I'm cleaning out field number two, which is just wheat, and all the wheat that would be there would be on just field number one. Is basically saying that it's not Peah in the other field at all, and that it's going to be treated as ordinary produce, which is subject for Truma and Meiser. In other words, he's saying that if one separates Peah from one field for another, it does not take effect. So very important, because if you're not going to be following this law, which is Doraita on having two different fields and leaving two different Peahs, then you have a big problem, because if you're doing it wrong, you can be either cheating the poor out of Peah, which is their right in the Torah, or you could be cheating the Kohen and the Levi, because they're in the Torah, they're subject to Truma and Meiser. So the Gemara is going to discuss this separation, a separation that's not mentioned in the Mishnah. And Rabbi Zera inquires of Rabbi Yasa if one intended to give Peah on behalf of the area from the boundary strip and beyond, what is the law? That is, in other words, if you have two fields adjoining and they are divided only by a boundary strip, can Peah left in one field exempt the obligation of the other field? So, okay, you have a boundary strip that's maybe an unirrigated area. Maybe it's pretty narrow. There's laws about how narrow it has to be in Masechet Kalayim. But let's say it's an unirrigated area, or it's an unplanted area, and it's being used to create a boundary strip. So what about the boundary strip? A lot of times the boundary strip in Kalayim is used to make sure that there's a separation between this side of the field and that side of the field, so you can plant two different types of crops. The Mishnah doesn't include that, and they're wondering, is that going to be enough for dividing a field into two for regards to Peah? So Rabbi Yasa avoided answering the question when Rabbi Zera asked him. And Rabbi Zera's question is pretty important, because effectively wants to know, are you making two different fields with this boundary area that can be used, these boundary strips that can be used to separate Kalayim? Is it also going to be separating it into, is it not only going to be separating it for Kalayim, but it's also going to be separating it for two different fields for Peah? That's effectively what Rabbi Zera is asking. And this, by the way, is not mentioned in the Mishnah as something for separation. So Rabbi Yasa's refusal to answer indicates that he was unsure whether this type of boundary strip divides a field with regards to Peah. Now, the Gemara is going to question this from a statement Rabbi Yasa himself makes in the explanation of a different Mishnah, which clearly implies that a boundary strip, like what we were talking about for separating for Kalayim, does also divide the field with regards to Peah. So it says, the Sugya says, Rabbi Yasa's response here seems to reverse his opinion elsewhere. So in other words, Rabbi Yasa came and answered the question. At this time, when Rabbi Zera asked him, he didn't give an answer, but it's clear that later on he gave an answer that made it definitive that this kind of boundary strip, like separating for areas for planting so that two different areas are not kalayim, that two different areas also would be subject to two different peahs. So the statement by Rabbi Yasa continues, and he says that we learned in a Mishnah there, in going to be in Peah, chapter 3, Halacha 1, that the sages concede to Rabbi Akiva that one who plants dill or mustard in 3 places gives Peah for each patch separately. So here's what's happening with Rabbi Akiva's statement. When Rabbi Akiva is talking about planting dill and mustard in different places, he's talking about this case of what happens if we have one area of the field that's more fertilized than the other. And so this area of dill is growing faster than that area of dill, and the third area of dill is even less fertilized than the first or second, and that's growing even later. So you effectively harvest, you're harvesting the area in this area, and you're doing that first, and then in the second area you're doing that second at a later date, maybe 5 days later or a week later. And then the other one matures much slower. Maybe you're harvesting it 2 weeks later. And effectively, Rabbi Akiva is saying is that you can't count that as a single field, that because it's being fertilized and ripening in different areas, it's effectively going to be subject to 3 different peahs. Because even though it's all on the same field, that it's not really ripening at the same time because of the differences in fertilization of the field itself. So Rabbi Yasa's statement about the Mishnah is gonna say that this is the meaning of our Mishnah: dill in 3 places, mustard in 3 places, and the Gemara is gonna explain this. It's gonna say Shmuel says the reason each patch of dill or mustard requires its own peah is because the first plant among them to ripen does not wait for the last plant among them to ripen. Rather, each is picked at a different time, and hence each requires a different peah. Rabbi Yasa says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, the reason each patch of dill or mustard requires its own peah is because dill and mustard are commonly grown in patches. Now, keep in mind that when they're harvesting the mustard and the dill, they're harvesting it for seed. They want the seeds. They're not doing it for their chilled salmon with cream cheese and dill on top. They're not doing it for the plant. They're really doing it for the seed. So that's why when they're harvesting it for the seed, that would be subject to peah. Anyway, so each plant is therefore, or each patch is basically going to be treated as a separate field, so that even if it looks like a single field, each of these patches that are ripening in different times because of the different fertilization of the ground, that's going to constitute a different field. So from Rabbi Yasa's explanation emerges that even if several patches are planted next to one another, peah must be left separately for each of them. And why should this be so when they are separated from one another by no more than a boundary, like what we're using the boundaries for in separating for kalayim, which you can see in chapter 2 in kalayim. So it's Lag BaOmer in the background, so you can hear all the celebration. Anyway, the Gemara concludes the question and says, and yet, here he says thus that just as Rabbi Yasa avoided answering Rabbi Zera's inquiry because he was unsure whether the boundary separates for peah, as a result of the challenge, the Gemara revises its understanding of Rabbi Zera's question and Rabbi Zera's reluctance to respond. So the sugya continues and says, it was clear to Rabbi Zera that a boundary strip divides between two fields and requires each to have its own peah. But this was never his question. Well, that's interesting. That's a chiddush. So basically, that's a big chiddush. So what was Rabbi Zera asking? So it's saying that the sugya says it was necessary for Rabbi Zera to ask only whether what grows out of the boundary strip itself can take effect as peah for the adjoining field, or whether it cannot take effect as peah. And this was the question Rabbi Yasa avoided in answering. In other words, it looks like, hey, wait, how come Rabbi Yasa doesn't know this? We know that they have these boundary strips that are used all the time to separate for Kalayim. Well, Rabbi Yasa surely knows that, right? So how come you don't know that you can separate for Kalayim over here for over there, but wouldn't that make two different fields for Peah too? Because it separates for Kalayim, for fields of Kalayim. But that's actually, turns out, not what Rabbi Zera was asking. And turns out that that's actually not what Rabbi Yasa was not answering. He was answering of what's happening if you have this strip and now you have the things that you planted in one of the fields now growing in the strip itself. Perhaps when you were sowing the field and throwing the grain, perhaps the wind blew it into the strip. And so now you have lots and lots of this thing effectively growing in this strip. And so it's really not a separation at all. It really makes it contiguous. So this boundary strip, let's say you have two different fields of wheat, and maybe you wanted to put a boundary strip not for Kalayim, but because one was red wheat and one was white wheat, or one was a different variety of wheat, which wheat is not subject to Kalayim with itself. So you were just, you had a heritage crop on this side and a heritage crop on that side, and it was windy that day, and you have a small boundary strip so that you know that you have your amaranth wheat on this one, and you have your red wheat on that one, and you have your little boundary strip there, and the wind blows while you're doing it. Now the boundary strip has lots and lots of wheat in it growing there. Is that now going to be really just one field? That's really what the question is. So the Gemara is going to resolve the question. Rabbi Hoshaya taught in a brisa, if one separates Peah from one field for another, it does not take effect. And he heard in the explanation of this brisa that even Peah left on the boundary strip does not take effect for the field. In other words, the Vilna Gaon saying that in concluding the Gemara's discussion of the boundary strip, it should be noted that the question posed here by Rabbi Zera and Rabbi Yasa's reaction to it appears in an almost identical form in Yerushalmi Baba Batra 3.1, and it's basically, the Gemara is going to be quoting the Gemara's question over there regarding ownerless property, and we are meant to understand from it that the same question applies to Peah. The Vilna Gaon says that Rabbi Zera himself asked a question here with regards to Peah. So according to the Vilna Gaon, Rabbi Zera asked this question of Rabbi Yasa's twice, once in regards to ownerless property and once in regard to Peah, and on both occasions Rabbi Yasa declined to answer. The explanation of both the Vilna Gaon and the Mara Fulda assume that the law of a boundary strip is the same for Peah as it is for ownerless property. Our Gemara conclusion that two fields divide by nothing more than a boundary strip are considered separate fields with regards to Peah is consistent with the Gemara's ruling of Baba Batra. Also, that two ownerless fields divide by a boundary strip cannot be acquired with a kinyan made in one of them. So the Bavli in Baba Batra 55a is going to put a dispute about this. It's going to be saying that a boundary strip does not divide for Peah, but the Yerushalmi here concludes that it does divide for Peah. The Yerushalmi and the Bavli had different traditions regarding the view of Rabbi Yasa, who in the Bavli is Rabbi Asi. Tomorrow we're going to get into part of the boundaries of the land. and in continuing this. And what's important to know, you might be saying, why do I care about Peah in two different fields? Why, who cares? Why do I care about this? I'm not a farmer. Um, and I'll tell you why. Because there is a lot of farming in Eretz Yisrael, and people have to know, because inside of there is Peah, and you're supposed to be taking part of the crop and dedicating it to the poor people. Now, okay, maybe the poor people today aren't driving up to your field, but there are a lot of charities that take produce and give it to poor families. And if you're farming in Eretz Yisrael, which farming is a huge industry here, you can be taking that Peah and be giving it to poor people. There's rules in this Masechet about what happens if you cut all the produce. It's saying that you're supposed to give the cut produce to the charity box, to the city charity box, to distribute to the poor. And you can still be doing that mitzvah today. So that if you're having two different fields, that you should be calculating 1/60th and 1/60th, and that really should be given to the poor. And we have to do our businesses honestly in our life. We're here and we have to work, and we have to do things according to what the Torah says. Part of the way Torah says to do things, if you're going to be growing food here in the land, and you're going to be doing a big business with it, you have to dedicate part of that over to taking part of that produce, and you have to feed the poor with it. You really have to be an active part of society and community. And these laws are relevant today, and these laws do matter today, and there are poor families who do need food in Eretz Yisrael. And you can't harden your heart and just try to separate yourself from poor people. So that's why this matters in the calculation, whether it's going to be one field or two fields, whether this is going to be a division. And it does matter to you. It does matter to you. Even if you don't have a field, it does matter to you to start to sharpen your mind about ownership of property and what rights do poor people have, and how do we allocate Meiser and charity and Trumos and Meiser and Peah and all that stuff. It's to sharpen your mind. Anyway, we'll get back to it tomorrow.